Lara never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts were childish tales, and vampires were the stuff of old legends and horror films. Yet, fate has a way of proving our skepticism wrong. It began on a stormy evening when the rain fell in relentless sheets, drenching the streets and blurring the city lights. Lara had been caught in the downpour, her umbrella torn and useless against the wind. Desperate for shelter, she noticed a silhouette in the distance, a mansion, dark, looming, and undeniably abandoned. Its towering gates creaked under the wind, and the windows were black voids, as though the house itself were asleep. With nowhere else to go, she pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The air within was heavy and electric, carrying the scent of damp wood, old stone, and something faintly metallic that made her stomach churn. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the cracked floorboards, moving as if alive. Lara's pulse quickened, but she pressed forward, the light from her phone barely cutting through the darkness. Then she saw him. He was standing at the top of a sweeping staircase, tall, impossibly pale, with sharp features that seemed almost sculpted. His eyes glowed faintly gold, like molten metal catching the dim light, and they fixed on her with unnerving intensity. He stepped down with silent, graceful movements, his coat trailing behind him. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. Fear rooted Lara to the spot, but curiosity, fueled by adrenaline, kept her from fleeing. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The man who introduced himself as Lucien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he circled her slowly, observing her with a predator's precision. "I am going to give you a choice," he finally said. "Survive 24 hours in this mansion with me. If you succeed, you leave. If you fail—" He smiled, revealing a flash of fangs. Cold dread surged through her, yet a part of her refused to believe he would actually harm her. It felt like some cruel game, testing courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The first hours were the worst. The house seemed alive, creaking and groaning as though it resented their presence. Every shadow moved against her, every sound made her jump. The flutter of wings, the distant dripping of water, the echo of his footsteps that appeared and disappeared at will. Lucien never touched her, never attacked, but he was always there. One moment, he was in the hallway, leaning against the wall with golden eyes fixed on her. The next, he appeared in the doorway behind her. The house was a maze of dim corridors, and she felt trapped in a web, every corner harboring some unseen threat. By the third hour, exhaustion began to claw at her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Panic whispered to her to run, but she remembered his words: survive or fail. As the night deepened, Lucien's behavior grew more enigmatic. At times, he vanished entirely, leaving Lara alone with the silence of the mansion and her own thoughts. Other times, he spoke softly, almost intimately, sharing fragments of his existence. He told her of centuries lived in darkness, of endless nights, of loneliness that even immortality could not soothe. There was an odd humanity in his words, a vulnerability that made her wonder if he was as much a prisoner of his condition as she was a captive of fear. Lara realized that fear was no longer her only companion. Fascination had crept in, mingling with adrenaline, and she could not deny the strange pull he exerted on her senses. Midnight brought a new horror. The mansion seemed to awaken fully. Faint whispers echoed down the hallways, shadows moved as though guided by some unseen hand, and the temperature dropped until her breath formed misty clouds. Lucien's presence became almost overwhelming, a constant pressure at the edge of her perception. Yet, he did not attack. Instead, he watched her struggle through the darkness, a silent observer testing her resolve. Each room was a challenge. Corridors that twisted impossibly, staircases that seemed longer than they should be, rooms that defied logic. By hour 15, fatigue had begun to warp her perception of time. The boundaries between the mansion and reality blurred, and she could no longer be sure if Lucien was human or something far older, far stranger. Dawn approached like a distant promise. Lara's body was weary, her mind frayed, yet she refused to give in. Lucien appeared before her one last time, his golden eyes intense and unreadable. "You have done well," he said quietly, his voice carrying both relief and admiration. Lara, trembling, looked around at the mansion, its shadows finally softened by the first pale light of morning. "I survived," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain ceasing outside. He nodded once, a gesture of respect, before retreating into the darkness. When she stepped outside, the sunlight felt alien, warm, and almost blinding after the suffocating darkness of the mansion. Her body ached, but her heart was alive with the thrill of survival. Though she had endured the night, part of her knew that her life had changed irrevocably. She had faced a vampire and lived. She had survived 24 hours in the company of a creature of myth, and yet in the deepest part of her mind, she knew she would never forget the golden eyes that watched her every move or the strange magnetic pull that had almost made her wish she could stay. By noon, Lara returned home, rain-soaked and exhausted, but alive. She avoided mirrors, afraid to see the pale reflection of fear still lingering in her eyes. Though she tried to tell herself it was over, the memory of the mansion and Lucien haunted her. Every shadow in her apartment, every sudden creak of the floorboards made her heart skip. She realized survival was not just physical, it was a mental battle, a confrontation with courage, curiosity, and the unknown. 24 hours had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. She had survived the night, but she also knew something had survived within her, a fascination, a fear, and a connection to a being she could never explain. By evening, she began to write down her experience, though she doubted anyone would believe her. The story of the storm, the mansion, the vampire, and the challenge, the story of her 24 hours in darkness, was too strange, too unbelievable. Yet in her chest, her heart beat faster when she recalled Lucien's golden eyes, his calm, omnipresent gaze, and the whispered words of a being who had walked through centuries of night. She had survived, yes, but the memory, the thrill, and the terror would never leave her.